Should the calendar be lengthened? What about renovations? What about the future of the sport? The death of its star athletes euthanizing the horses. Horse racing in Maryland is at a crossroads for sure. The news comes fast and furious. So how do we get through it all? What does the future hold for the industry? There's only one person to ask. Hi, I'm Kevin Battle. This is WCBM. Representing horse trainers and owners, his goal is the betterment of horse racing industry in America. He is one of the most influential individuals in the sport, and he lives right here in Baltimore, Maryland, where the entire industry is, well, I guess on shaky ground. Well, there's an atmosphere around it right now. Mr. Alan Foreman is the lead counsel for many equine organizations, and he is the chairman and CEO of the Thoroughbred Horsemen's Association. Good day, Alan Foreman, and thank you very much for joining us here on WCBM.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Well, to say you have your work cut out for you, I guess would be an understatement. So how long have you been affiliated with horse racing, and what spurred your passion?
Well, I've been involved in the Maryland horse racing industry since 1975. I was with a Baltimore law firm that actually represented Pimlico Racecourse, the owners of Pimlico Racecourse. And about 4 years into my career, our governor went to federal prison in a racetrack scandal, as did a number of others. Harry Hughes was elected governor. Steve Sachs was elected attorney general in what was supposed to be a reform administration. And I was contacted by Steve Sachs's office and asked if I would be interested in working in the attorney general's office. I went for an interview, and the first question he asked me was, what do you know about horse racing? And so from there, I was appointed as counsel to the Department of what was then Licensing and Regulation, which regulated the racing industry among a number of other state industries. And I became counsel to the Maryland Racing Commission at a time when racing was among the top three sports in the country, top three or four. Yet boxing was pretty big back then. You had baseball, football, although football was just starting to really grow, and you had horse racing. And so I came in at a very opportune time, and in my 3 years in the Attorney General's office, I had some very high-profile national cases, the most important being the 1980 Preakness lack of disqualification involving Codex and Genuine Risk. I represented the stewards in that case that had a lot of national attention. And my career took off from there. When I left the Attorney General's office, industry organizations called and asked if I could do some legal work for them, and my career took off. I'm probably the only lawyer in the country in the equine sport who does what I do. So it's a very unique practice, very unusual. And I'm proud that I've been able to do it from here in Maryland.
And Maryland is very proud of the horse racing industry, despite any of the controversies or any of the scandals or the job-related issues that are taking place today. I thought that some of the problems went back to right around 2009, 2010 with slots machines when I first got to Baltimore. But you're proof that it goes back into the mid-'70s and before that. How many people work in the horse industry in Maryland, and what is the economic impact?
There are 28,000 people in this state who are employed in one way or another in connection with the equine industry. Not all of that is racing related, but in supporting the equine industry. 25% of the agricultural land in the state of Maryland is devoted to horses, which is a pretty staggering number. And if you, as I do, drive throughout the state, you appreciate the beauty of this state. And everywhere you go, you will see a horse farm in any of our counties, and people who are engaged in the business in one way, shape, form, or another. The value to the economy of the equine industry in the state is approximately $2 billion. The racing industry is probably responsible for almost $600 million of that $2 billion. But it's a very substantial industry to the state from an economic standpoint. But I would also point out to you that it does something else for Maryland. It's the history and the culture and the identification of the horse and the equine industry with the state of Maryland that is something that you almost can't put a value on.
I agree with you 100% on that statement. Growing up in western Pennsylvania, I loved horses, but everybody said Maryland is horse country. it's ubiquitous in Maryland, and it's an amazing industry, and that's why today's conversation is so important. Every week seems to bring news in the horse racing industry in Maryland. This week is no different. Citing financial challenges, the owners of Pimlico Racecourse notified employees this week that they're shutting down the off-track betting facility by June 30th. That facility only seems really busy a few days of the year. Did this move, it's another blow to the facility, did it surprise you?
It did not surprise me at all. Under the current circumstances, the owners of the racetrack are trying to do what they can to reduce expenses. Pimlico is an enormously expensive building to maintain, and it's only used for a short time during the year. And given the financial condition of the ownership of the tracks here and the industry, they're taking whatever steps they can right now until the redevelopment plan is fleshed out and executed on to reduce their expenses. There is an OTB 5 miles away at Timonium, and it almost makes no sense for the two facilities to be competing against each other. When the Pimlico OTB was created, as we created off-track betting facilities around the state, there was more activity at Pimlico. There was more justification for it, but it's hard to justify keeping that small location open right now when there's one as close as 5 miles away. So, yeah, we expected it, and it did not come as a surprise.
Yeah, it makes economic sense. But speaking of money, we were talking about renovating Pimlico again, rebuilding Laurel Park as a training facility or building a brand new training facility. How much money are we talking about? These deals seem to happen, or agreements seem to take place every 5 years, but nothing gets done for various reasons. What are we looking at now? What is the plan of renovating the facilities that are getting pretty dilapidated?
The plan is at a standstill right now. Let me just give you a little bit of background so that people understand where this all came from. There was a lawsuit that was brought by the city of Baltimore against the Stronach Group, the owners of Laurel and Pimlico, 4 years ago, to eminent domain and to condemn Pimlico, and for the city of it was brought by the city of Baltimore to take over the facilities. And that was the result of an effort by the owners of the racetrack to close Pimlico, move racing to Laurel, build a super track at Laurel, and move the Preakness to Laurel. And that enraged the local politicians. It even angered the folks in the state legislature. So the lawsuit was brought. In an effort to settle the lawsuit, there was a quiet negotiating team that was brought together. I was asked to be part of that group on behalf of the racing industry. There was a representative from the city of Baltimore and from the tracks. And we came up with the concept plan that is now and has been under consideration for the owner of the track at Pimlico to donate the land to the city of Baltimore, renovate Pimlico, run a short Pimlico meet at Pimlico, and move and consolidate racing to Laurel. This is all about the racing industry. It's not about anything else, although clearly the redevelopment of the Park Heights area is a major concern and a major point of interest for the city of Baltimore. But at the end of the day, it's about the racing industry and being able to accommodate the racing industry, because if you close Pimlico for training purposes, and we train at both Pimlico and Laurel, and you consolidate it at Laurel, you have to have a facility that can accommodate the consolidation. And so we came up with a concept plan that would rebuild Pimlico and turn it into a commercial zone facility. There'd be commercial parcels on the property, a downsized new clubhouse at Pimlico. There would be a Pimlico meet, maybe one other meet during the year, but no training at all at Pimlico during the year. Consolidation at Laurel for 1,400 horses, new racing surfaces, new backstretch, new grandstand at Laurel that we estimated at the time would cost $375 million. Now that we didn't have the ability to deal with the kind of experts through the Stadium Authority, but we took that concept plan to the Maryland General Assembly. They endorsed the plan, and that $370 million was to be paid for by the sale of bonds, underwritten by bonds issued by the Maryland Stadium Authority, and the projects would be overseen by the Maryland Stadium Authority. And they stepped in when The bill became law, and they took over the project. In the course now of 3 or 4 years of trying to develop designs and implement the plan, we've run into several problems. One, we hit COVID and the delays caused by COVID. Number two, inflation and the cost of material supplies. And we ran into a tax problem that, with respect to Laurel, improvements that would be made at Laurel would be taxed to the owner of the property at capital gains rates, unless that property was owned by the state or the county, which means that the state would have to buy Laurel or the county would have to buy Laurel. And what is the likelihood that the state would spend state money to buy, the racetrack at Laurel? So we were forced to look at other alternatives. And the other problem was that the stating authority came in and they determined that Laurel was in as bad a shape, if not worse, than Pimlico. And it could not be rehabilitated. It had to be completely redone. And so when they analyzed the cost to do Laurel combined with what it would cost to do Pimlico, the cost of the project had skyrocketed to almost double what we estimated when we did the concept plan 4 years ago. And therein lies the rub. Number one, insufficient funds to do the project. How would you close the shortfall? How do you solve the problem of the tax issue at Laurel? And is the project feasible? In addition to that, there's been an industry agreement on the sharing of revenues to stem the losses that the owners of the tracks are incurring. That agreement expired at the end of 2022, and there have been some very difficult negotiations about the continuation of that agreement and the willingness and ability of the stakeholders to continue to financially support the ownership operations. And so with all of that, we propose the creation of a state authority to take over the project, study the issues, make recommendations, and essentially oversee what will be the future of racing going forward. And that law became effective today. So we're waiting for the governor to make the appointments to the authority and let them start working.
We're speaking with Alan Foreman, Chairman and CEO of the Thoroughbred Horsemen's Association, about the future of horse industry and horse racing in Maryland. It looks like it could be a bright future if everything goes as planned, or it could be a dim future. Can the horse racing industry sustain itself without this much-needed influx of cash? Is it a viable industry on its own?
Well, let me just make clear to everyone, nobody's asking the state for money. The industry is redirecting money that it already gets to make this project happen. For example, I represent the horsemen, the breeders, and we are already contributing into the fund for this project $5 million a year from the share that we get of VLT revenues. We don't have a casino at our racetracks like they do in our surrounding states. Mm-hmm. We get a small piece of the handle at the casinos for purses and for capital improvements at the racetrack. We are redirecting our own money from our own pockets into this project. So there is no outside state money going into this project. So that seems to get lost in the discussion. The question ultimately will become, what's the best way we can accomplish this project? What will it cost to do so? And if there is a shortfall between what we are currently committing to the project and what we will need, how do we come up with those funds? And then the ownership issue also, and the ownership of land. So that there are a lot of possibilities here, and Maryland racing is going to look different when this is done and over. And of course, as you know, there's a lot of discussion right now about moving forward with Pimlico perhaps becoming the hub of Maryland racing. That has a host of positives, a host of negatives, and so that's all got to be studied here, and studied in pretty short order.
Yeah, pretty quickly. And I guess you would do a face palm if you could go back to 2009 and convince the owner of the track to purchase a slots license, right? That would have changed everything.
Well, I mean, the law was written for him, okay? And interestingly, rather than specifically name Laurel as a destination facility for a casino, Pimlico was always out of the mix, because the city didn't want it at Pimlico. The locals didn't want it at Pimlico. They drew a territory with the intention that the only applicant would be the owner of Laurel. It was Frank Stronach at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Dave Cordish owned a parcel that was in that territory, and he put a placeholder application in. I don't know that he had any expectation that he was ultimately going to get awarded the license. But the owner, Mr. Stronach, the owner of Laurel, failed to properly file his application. He filed his application but didn't put up the bond that was required with the application, and he was disqualified. And so Laurel, as a facility to host gaming, to get a casino license, was disqualified, and it put us out of play. Probably the lowest moment in the history of Maryland racing, because we have had to figure out how we maintain this industry, the breeding industry, and the thousands of jobs without the ability, like our neighboring states, to have a casino at the racetrack that would have caused tremendous redevelopment in the Laurel area, but also would have provided the kinds of revenues that would have stabilized and things. We wouldn't be having the kind of discussions that we're probably having right now.
Absolutely. And talk about stabilization. We've mentioned the date a couple of times. June 30th, a significant date, not only for off-track betting's demise at Pimlico, but the 10-year agreement between the Maryland Jockey Club, the Thoroughbred Horsemen's Association, and the Maryland Horse Breeders Association for racing operations in Maryland. That's due to expire on that date, June 30th as well. That agreement had been extended 6 months from December. What will happen if that deadline is breached?
The deadline's not going to be breached. The parties reached an agreement yesterday. It's just a matter of getting the signatures on the document, and the agreement will be extended another 6 months through December 31, and that's to give the newly created Maryland Thoroughbred Racetrack Operating Authority time to begin its work. They are required under the new law to submit a report to the leadership of the General Assembly with recommendations going forward, their initial recommendations, including an identification of potential sites for a racing or training center to complement the needs of the industry. When I came into the business, there were 4 operating racetracks in Maryland. Now we're down to basically 2, and ultimately it could be 1. And you've got to accommodate on a year-round basis 1,400 horses, the trainers, the backstretch workers, housing for the backstretch workers. It's a tall challenge in a way that we've never looked at this industry before. And so the authority has to make certain recommendations by December 1, and that will, I think, help to guide the stakeholders in the industry going forward with respect to any long-term agreements with regards to funding.
He's a legal counsel, chairman and CEO of the Thoroughbred Horsemen's Association. Alan Foreman is joining us here on WCBM. You mentioned that horse racing is going to look different in Maryland after all these deals come to fruition, once the tracks, the future of the tracks is settled. Speaking of looking different, 7 horses ran in the Preakness this year. Mage was the only one to race in the Derby 2 weeks earlier. The Triple Crown format has been in place since, I believe, the early 1950s. Yet owners and trainers say they need more time to get horses ready between races. Will the future of horse racing, will the schedule change as well to add a week between the Derby and the Preakness?
I mean, it could, but then there's a ricochet effect because the New York Racing Association, which runs the Belmont, would then have to move their race back another week. The spacing of the races is an interesting conversation and one that is very controversial. It's a very divisive issue because of those who believe historically you don't want to disturb the Triple Crown. If you do so, if you change the schedule, do you put an asterisk beside all the horses' names that now run under the new schedule because they're running in a different schedule than historically those that have previously won? And I don't know if going an extra week would have made a difference with the horses that went to the Derby this year. They all look at their schedules and they decide what they want to do. The Derby is a very demanding race, and a lot of trainers now look for other opportunities. There are other opportunities on the calendar, particularly if their horse is not going to be a Triple Crown contender. The importance of the Preakness of the Belmont may look different to them when there are other opportunities in other jurisdictions throughout the summer and throughout the year. So I don't know that moving it back a week would have made a difference in the field this year. Trainers are just, they look at horses differently. They look at their schedules differently now than they ever did. Typically, horses that came into the Triple Crown would stay if they were healthy. That's changing, and there are lots of reasons for it.
And let's get to horse deaths. The director of the equine safety with the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority says data indicates fatalities were 1.3 per 1,000 starts at Laurel Park this year. That's down from last year, despite the press that's been around some of the deaths. She concluded that the track conditions were not the issue, but urged the associations to take advantage of proven enhancements to improve horse safety. Yet track conditions were what we were told caused the cancellation of racing for a week earlier this year, and the track was scrutinized, criticized, and the concerns were addressed. What is the issue, and why does the track keep being blamed?
Well, the issue was the racing surface. I would maintain, and look, this is an area that I have expertise. I did the study, the widely acclaimed study with three others 10 years ago of 21 equine fatalities at Aqueduct Racecourse. I was an appointee of Governor Cuomo at the time to investigate those fatalities. So this is an area that I do know something about. And I don't think there's any question that the issues that we had at Laurel this year were related to the track surface. And we've been fighting track surface issues at Laurel for several years. It's been a vexing problem. It would have been impossible for the representative from HISA to conclude that the track was safe and it was not a surface issue because they did not conduct an investigation. And I think she may have been misquoted or have misstated what she was trying to convey by saying that racing is better in Maryland because your fatality rate is lower than the national average. The fact of the matter is that we brought an expert in to evaluate the racing surface and the maintenance protocols. And those protocols were changed, and there was a change made to the consistency and composition of the racing surface. And since those changes were made, there have been no incidents at Laurel. It was, at least in the opinion of the horsemen, unmistakable that the cluster of injuries and fatalities that were suffered were primarily the result of the track surface. And so, but I have to tell you, that when we have fatalities, and there's an active investigation right now at Churchill Downs because they had what we call a cluster of fatalities. Fatalities are very unusual. They're rare. And when you see a large number of them in a short period of time, we call them clusters, and you have to dive in very quickly like an airplane crash and try to figure out are there any common factors? Are there things that we missed in our protocols? What is it that is causing this cluster of fatalities? I mean, I think it was fair to conclude with what was going on here in Maryland, it was a track surface issue. Okay. But the issue of a fatal breakdown, a catastrophic breakdown of a horse is multifactorial. Okay. There are a lot of factors that can contribute to a horse breaking down. We have extensive protocols in place to try to prevent that from happening. We know what the risk factors are, and there are probably others that we're not aware of. It still happens, and it's a fact of our business, and it's an unfortunate fact of our business. And our responsibility is to try to prevent them from happening. And when they do happen, that we can learn from it. And that's what happened here in Maryland, and that's what's happening right now at Churchill Downs. But no question, it's troubling. Ridden anywhere I go right now where people don't ask me about this.
Yeah, and people like me, a novice, would say, it seems like, is there an easier way to diagnose the horse? I mean, does it always have to be fatal? I know a lot of horses are donated to different clubs and organizations if they receive an injury, but it seems like some of them, are we zoomed in too tight on the injury, an injury that was survivable 10 years ago, and maybe they go through rehab, but due to science, it's deemed fatal now?
Look, we do what is best for the health and welfare of the horse. Okay, you don't want a horse to suffer. Horses are euthanized in those situations where there is no other alternative, where the prognosis is poor, or the quality of life for the horse is going to be poor. It is not something that is routinely done. And if these horses can be saved, we take them, we put them into programs that we have to rehabilitate them and hopefully place them back, not back necessarily in racing, and probably not in racing, but there are other equine activities they can participate in, or they can become pleasure horses. The people who are involved in this business adore these animals. We always like to say that they're treated better than we treat our own people, but they are. And when a horse dies, it's like a death in the family. This is not something that's easy to accept. It's a fact of our business, and when I would get the phone calls in the morning that there was an incident at Laurel, it's not a great way to start your day. And you talk to the people who are involved, and they're just devastated by it. So we do everything we can to prevent that from happening. And if a horse does suffer a catastrophic injury, we do everything we can to see if that horse can be saved. And if so, we do it. And if there is no alternative, or the better option is to euthanize the horse, that's why it's done. The horse that broke down on Preakness Day had to be euthanized. There was no other option.
And you've seen the headlines. The circus has changed. There's no elephants, no animals in a lot of the circuses around the country. Dog racing shut down. SeaWorld has no whales anymore. How much pressure is on the horse racing industry, and will it be viable in the future, regardless of politics, regardless of investment in facilities? Can it move forward when so many other aspects of gaming and animals has been shut down?
Well, I think it will, because I think it's so much a part of the history, the culture, and the economy of so many states in this country. The industry may look different, but every business, every sport evolves and changes. But I saw one of the leaders of one of the major animal rights groups who we've dealt with for years said, the industry is too large and too important to the economy to think that it's going to go away, but we all collectively have to do better. I think that's a really fair statement. We always have to do better. We're not going to get to zero. It's a fact of our business. These horses are bred to race. They will not and could not serve any other purpose. And so if you were to shut the industry down tomorrow, you'd have one of the greatest animal welfare crises that you can imagine, because there would be no place for these animals to go. Our responsibility is to them. They are the foundation of our sport. And if we're not doing right by them, we don't deserve to remain in business. But I think we are. And I think when people understand how devoted and how committed we are to this, I think they hopefully would feel differently.
What about the fan situation? There's so much competition for the fans' dollars and attention, the eyes. Horse racing it's had its peaks and valleys. Attendance was down a little bit. Some of that was weather-related at Preakness this year. How do you keep fans engaged?
Well, our fans, we were the only sport where you were allowed to wager on the internet until the legalization of sports betting and now mobile sports betting. We were the only exception. And a substantial portion of our business is done online. Telephone account wagering, internet wagering, substantial part of our business, and will continue to be. And that's what fans want. We have to reimagine. That's why I was such a big fan of the concept plan here in Maryland, these new racetracks, because we're going to do what a number of other sports do. At Camden Yards, they're not putting more seats in. They're taking seats out, because what people today want to do is move around. They don't want to sit in a seat. They want an experience when they're at a facility. And that's what we were trying to imagine, and we're trying to imagine at the new facilities here. We are in an enormously competitive marketplace. When I started in the business, the only way you could gamble in this country was to go to Las Vegas or bet on horses, which is why horse racing was so important. Then they brought in the lottery. Then they brought in casino gaming. They brought in sports betting. We have had one competitive factor after another challenge the way we do business, and yet we're still a multi-billion-dollar business. So clearly, we're not what we were. We are a niche business like any number of other sports, but one that continues to demonstrate popularity. And while our numbers have declined, and you can trace it to competition, it's still a significant economic benefit.
Alan Foreman, Chairman, CEO of the Thoroughbred Horsemen's Association, thank you so much for your insight, the historical perspective of things, and the look into the future. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.